Ellie pushed the heavy hospital door open, her palms slick with sweat, her breath shallow as if every inhale scraped against her ribs. The sterile hallway stretched endlessly, each fluorescent light buzzing louder than the last, mocking the silence in her chest. She wanted to run backward, to escape this place, but her trembling legs betrayed her and carried her forward. A nurse glanced at her with pity, whispering something she couldn't hear. Ellie's world was collapsing in fragments she couldn't hold together. She stepped inside the room, and the sight before her froze her soul. The heart monitor was flat, a shrill tone filling the air like a cruel hymn. Dr. Chen looked at her, his eyes heavy with sorrow. He said, "I'm sorry, Ellie. There's nothing more we can do." The words sliced through her like broken glass, leaving her gasping, clutching at the air as if it could hold her upright. Tears blurred her vision, the sterile walls melting into waves of grief. Her knees buckled, the floor catching her weightless body. Ellie cried, "No, this can't be real." Every fiber in her screamed to turn back time, but the finality in the room smothered her hope. In that moment, she felt her past and future collapse into a single unbearable truth. She was utterly alone. Ellie's sobs echoed against the walls, raw and broken, each one ripping through the sterile silence. The world outside the room carried on, footsteps clicking, carts rolling, voices murmuring. But inside, time had collapsed. She lifted her head, eyes swollen, lips trembling as if words had betrayed her. She whispered, "Why him? Why now?" Her grief was not loud but suffocating, wrapping around her chest like iron chains. Dr. Chen remained near the bed, eyes lowered, his silence carrying more weight than words. Ellie's gaze fell on the lifeless body, and her heart screamed though her mouth stayed shut. Every memory of laughter, arguments and dreams twisted into knives that cut deeper with every second. She clenched the bedsheet in her fist, refusing to let go. In that moment, she wasn't just mourning a death. She was mourning the shattering of her anchor, the end of a chapter she was never ready to close. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, but to Ellie it carried the scent of endings. She pressed her forehead against the mattress, her body curling into itself like a child hiding from the storm. Nurse Patel knelt beside her, soft hand resting near Ellie's shoulder, but not forcing comfort. She said quietly, "Take your time, you don't have to let go yet." Ellie shook her head violently, hair falling loose from its messy bun. She said, "If I let go, it means he's really gone." Silence pressed in again, heavy and cruel. The beeping of another monitor in the distance felt like a cruel reminder of life moving on, mocking her grief. Ellie's breaths came in shallow bursts, chest rising and falling like it might collapse inwards. The shadows in the room deepened, her despair filling every corner. She wasn't just losing him, she was losing the version of herself that had believed tomorrow was promised. Ellie finally sat upright, though her body felt carved from stone, her arms limp and heavy at her sides. Her eyes caught the small photograph taped to the edge of the monitor, a picture of them smiling in sunlight, captured in a time when everything seemed endless. She reached out, fingertips trembling as they brushed the corner of the photo. Her voice cracked as she said, "We had so much left. Why wasn't it enough?" The words scattered like broken glass across the room. Dr. Chen shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glancing toward the door as if giving her privacy. Ellie pressed the photo against her chest, her sobbing reduced to shallow whimpers. Her world felt unmoored, her foundation ripped apart by a force she couldn't fight. She whispered into the silence, "How do I live in a world without him?" The room had no answer, only the hum of electricity and the hollow ache of grief. Time blurred, minutes folding into hours though Ellie couldn't tell which. She rose slowly, unsteady, legs shaking beneath her as though the ground had shifted. She walked toward the window, hands pressed against the cold glass. The night outside was alive with lights, cars rushing, people living lives unaware of her loss. Her reflection stared back, eyes hollow, skin pale against the glow of neon. She whispered, "The world doesn't stop, does it?" Her breath fogged the glass, dissolving as quickly as it appeared. Behind her the room remained still, locked in a grief she couldn't carry forever. She turned back toward the bed, the stillness of the body pressing into her chest like a stone. She wanted to scream, but only silence came. Her journey had only begun, though she didn't yet know it. For now, she stood on the edge of despair, tethered to a past she wasn't ready to release. The morning sun spilled through half-closed blinds, casting sharp stripes of light across Ellie's hollow face. She hadn't slept. The night had dragged on like a punishment, each tick of the clock stabbing at her chest. Her phone buzzed with unanswered calls, messages from friends and family offering sympathy she couldn't bear to read. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee cooling before her. The bitterness of grief clung to her throat, making even water impossible to swallow. She whispered, "How do I breathe without falling apart?" Her hands trembled as she gripped the mug, the steam long gone. Every corner of the house carried echoes, laughter from dinners, footsteps down the hall, whispered promises in the dark. The silence now was suffocating. Her body ached with exhaustion, yet her mind refused rest, looping through memories she wasn't ready to release. In the stillness, she realized this was the first morning of the rest of her life, and it terrified her. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Ellie flinched, her heart racing at the intrusion. She opened the door to find Sarah, her closest friend, standing with a bag of groceries. Sarah's eyes softened and she said, "You don't have to do this alone." Ellie wanted to slam the door, to shut out kindness that felt unbearable, yet her body leaned into the comfort. Sarah stepped inside quietly, placing the bag on the counter, her movements slow, deliberate, as though not to break the fragile air. Ellie whispered, "I don't know how to keep going." Sarah reached out, brushing Ellie's arm gently, her own eyes wet. "You don't have to know today. Just breathe with me." They sat together at the table, the groceries untouched, the silence stretching but not empty. Ellie stared at her hands, fingers restless against the wood grain. Sarah leaned forward, her voice soft, "You're allowed to fall apart." Ellie shook her head, her eyes brimming. She said, "If I let myself break, I may never put the pieces back." Sarah exhaled, her expression torn between strength and grief of her own. "Then, let me hold them for you, until you can." The words pierced Ellie's heart, and for the first time in days, her body sagged with a sliver of release. A single sob escaped, raw and unrestrained, shattering the silence. Sarah moved closer, wrapping an arm around her, steady and unwavering. Ellie clung to her, the dam finally cracking, the pain pouring out in waves she could no longer contain. The kitchen filled with quiet sobs, two women bound by love and loss. The hours passed slowly, the groceries forgotten, shadows shifting across the room as the sun sank lower. Sarah brewed tea, the faint aroma filling the silence. She placed a cup in front of Ellie, who traced the steam with unfocused eyes. Sarah said gently, "Do you remember the hike last summer? You nearly gave up halfway, but you pushed through." Ellie managed a broken smile, her lips trembling. "That was different. That was just a hill." Sarah looked at her with quiet determination. "Every hill feels like a mountain when you're in the middle of it. But you climbed before, you can climb again." Ellie's chest rose sharply, her breath shaky. For the first time, the heaviness in the air loosened slightly, as though Sarah's words had cracked the suffocating silence. Ellie wasn't ready for hope, but the memory stirred something fragile within her. As evening fell, Ellie stood by the window, her reflection caught against the growing darkness outside. Sarah remained seated, watching quietly, giving space without leaving. Ellie whispered, "Everything feels empty." Sarah rose, joining her side, their reflections merging in the glass. She said, "It won't always feel this way. The pain doesn't vanish, but it changes." Ellie's chest ached with the weight of those words. She leaned her forehead against the glass, her breath clouding it briefly. Sarah gently placed a hand on her back, steady and grounding. For the first time, Ellie didn't flinch from comfort. She allowed herself to lean slightly into the presence beside her. The world outside glowed with scattered city lights, alive and unknowing. Inside, Ellie's world remained fractured, but a tiny flicker of connection reminded her she hadn't been left behind entirely. The days blurred together, yet Ellie's grief sharpened into something harsher. Bills piled on the counter, each envelope a reminder of a world that demanded her attention. She sat at the table, unopened letters spread like landmines. Her hands hovered, too afraid to touch. Her chest tightened as the clock ticked, each sound heavier than the last. She whispered, "I can't do this alone." Her body slumped forward, forehead pressing into her arms. The silence around her wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, pushing her toward collapse. The grief she carried was now joined by a new enemy, responsibility she couldn't outrun. A sharp knock rattled the door. Ellie startled, wiping her face with her sleeve. She opened it to find Mark, her estranged brother, standing stiffly. Mark, 34, male, fair skin, short dark hair, worn jacket, held a small envelope. His jaw was tense, his eyes conflicted. He said flatly, "We need to talk." Ellie's stomach dropped. She wanted to slam the door, but the weight in his tone stopped her. She stepped aside reluctantly, her voice trembling. "This isn't a good time." Mark crossed the threshold, his presence filling the fragile quiet with unspoken history. They sat opposite each other at the table, the silence dense. Ellie glared at the unopened envelope he placed between them. Mark leaned forward, his voice edged with guilt. "It's about Dad's will." Ellie's hands clenched in fists, her pulse racing. "You waited until now?" she hissed. His eyes softened briefly before hardening again. "We couldn't avoid this forever." Ellie's throat burned with anger, grief and betrayal colliding. The wounds between them ran deeper than paperwork, and the reminder of their fractured bond cut sharper than she was ready to bear. Ellie pushed the envelope back toward him, her voice breaking. "I don't care about money. I just lost everything that mattered." Mark rubbed his temple, frustration leaking through his restraint. "This isn't about money. It's about responsibility." Ellie's eyes flashed with hurt. "All I wanted was family, not this." The silence after her words carved through the room like a blade. Mark looked at her with unspoken regret, his voice dropping. "You're not the only one who lost." The truth of his pain hung heavy, but it only deepened Ellie's ache. The air grew heavier, neither willing to move first. Ellie stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor like a scream. "I can't do this, not now," she said, voice trembling. Mark rose slowly, his expression caught between anger and sorrow. He said quietly, "You're stronger than you think." Ellie froze at the doorway, his words stinging like both comfort and accusation. She whispered, "If I were strong, I wouldn't be breaking." For a moment, their eyes met, two wounded souls recognizing the fracture in each other. But Ellie turned away, leaving the room steeped in silence and regret. Ellie stood in the dim kitchen long after Mark had gone, the envelope untouched on the table like a curse. The silence pressed against her chest until breathing felt like drowning. She gathered the bills, her hands shaking as she tried to bring order to chaos. Each paper screamed of responsibilities she wasn't ready to face. She whispered, "It's all crumbling." Her knees threatened to buckle, but she gripped the counter, anchoring herself. The fridge hummed, a cruel reminder that life demanded normalcy even when her world had shattered. The weight of grief and duty threatened to bury her alive. The following morning, Ellie walked through the neighborhood, her steps slow, each one dragging. She passed closed shops, their shutters still down, and the world seemed muted. At the corner, she stopped at the pharmacy, hesitant before entering. The clerk offered a kind smile, but Ellie avoided his gaze. She clutched the medicine bag tightly, as though it carried more than pills. It carried proof that life still demanded her effort. Her chest tightened as she whispered, "I'm tired of being strong." She stepped outside again, sunlight spilling over her, but instead of warmth, it felt like exposure. That afternoon, Ellie sat in the park, the noise of children playing distant as if from another world. On the bench beside her sat Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly neighbor known for gentle wisdom. Mrs. Whitaker, 67, female, silver hair, long cardigan, kind but weathered face, looked at her with eyes that saw too much. She said, "Grief never leaves us, dear. It only changes shape." Ellie swallowed hard, tears threatening again. "I don't want to carry it forever." Mrs. Whitaker touched her hand softly. "You carry love too. That part never leaves." For a moment, Ellie allowed the words to settle. Later, Ellie returned home and found Sarah waiting outside her door, leaning against the railing. Sarah held 2 cups of coffee, her smile small but steady. "You weren't answering," she said softly. Ellie unlocked the door, her hands fumbling. Inside, Sarah set the coffee down and studied Ellie's tired face. "You don't have to carry this alone." Ellie shook her head, voice low. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Sarah's eyes softened. "Then let's figure it out together." Ellie's lips trembled, caught between breaking and believing. For the first time, the house didn't feel entirely empty. That evening, Ellie sat on the couch, Sarah beside her, the two of them wrapped in silence. A half-finished cup of coffee sat forgotten on the table. Ellie leaned back, exhaustion painting her face. Sarah broke the silence. "You've already survived your worst day. Every day after is proof you can keep going." Ellie's eyes filled, her voice a whisper. "It doesn't feel like survival. It feels like drowning." Sarah reached over, holding her hand firmly. "Then I'll be here to pull you up." Ellie's grip tightened, a fragile tether anchoring her in a storm she hadn't yet learned to navigate. Ellie sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of documents left untouched. She pulled open a drawer and found a small locked box she hadn't noticed in years. Inside, buried beneath papers, was a letter addressed to her in her late husband's handwriting. Her heart raced, hands trembling as she held the envelope. She whispered, "Why now?" The weight of his words, unopened and waiting, pressed against her chest like a stone. She hesitated, torn between the fear of what truth it carried and the desperate need to hear his voice again. Her grief twisted into dread as she broke the seal. The letter unfolded slowly in her trembling hands. Words written in his familiar slant filled the page, but one sentence froze her blood. He confessed to debts and secrets he had hidden, choices made in desperation that endangered them both. Ellie gasped, the room spinning. She whispered, "You lied to me." Tears blurred the ink, smudging his confession into shadows. "You." Every memory of trust cracked beneath the revelation. The love she had clung to became tangled with betrayal, and the man she mourned became a stranger. Her grief sharpened, transforming into a storm she hadn't expected. Ellie stormed into the living room, clutching the letter like a weapon. Sarah looked up from the couch, startled by her trembling frame. "He lied," Ellie spat, her voice cracking. She waved the letter wildly, her hands shaking. Sarah rose slowly, her face filled with concern. Ellie breathed. But Ellie couldn't stop. "He left me with this mess, this betrayal." Her sobs erupted, raw and bitter, echoing through the room. Sarah stepped closer, arms open, but Ellie stumbled backward, collapsing onto the couch. She cried, "I don't even know who I loved anymore." Mark arrived unannounced, stepping into the tension-filled room. Ellie thrust the letter toward him, voice trembling. "Did you know?" Mark's expression darkened, his silence damning. He finally said, "I tried to protect you." Ellie's voice rose, broken and furious. "Protect me? You lied to me too." The air between them snapped, years of resentment boiling over. Sarah moved to intervene but stopped, realizing this storm had to be faced. Ellie's body shook as betrayal piled upon betrayal, the last threads of her foundation unraveling. Her grief had transformed into fury, and the weight of truth nearly crushed her. The silence after her outburst hung thick, unbearable. Ellie dropped the letter, the paper fluttering to the floor like ash. She collapsed into a chair, her strength gone. Mark stood frozen, guilt etched across his face. Sarah finally stepped forward, kneeling at Ellie's side. "You're not broken by this," she whispered. Ellie shook her head, tears streaming. Everything I believed was a lie. Sarah took her hand firmly. No, Ellie. Love isn't erased by mistakes. You're stronger than the secrets left behind. Ellie closed her eyes, her chest aching, the revelation cutting deep, but forcing her closer to a painful truth. She had to let go. The storm inside Ellie had grown too strong to ignore. She stood in front of the mirror, her face pale and streaked with dried tears, holding the letter crumpled in her hand. Behind her reflection, she no longer saw the woman she used to be. She saw someone who had been broken and reshaped by grief. She whispered, "I can't carry your secrets anymore." The silence of the room swallowed her voice, but the weight of the words grounded her. The mirror trembled in her blurred vision as she finally admitted that she wasn't only mourning her husband, she was mourning the version of herself that had trusted too blindly. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, meeting her own hollow eyes. "This ends tonight," she said, her voice steadier, as though summoning a strength she had hidden beneath the rubble of her pain. Ellie drove through rain-slicked streets, the wipers swiping furiously, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Her chest tightened with every turn, but she didn't slow. The night air pressed heavily, streetlights streaking across the windshield like fire. She whispered into the darkness, "I need answers." The hum of the engine drowned out her thoughts, but her heart pounded with the rhythm of confrontation. She pulled into Mark's driveway, the house looming in shadows. For a long moment, she sat in the car, trembling, torn between retreat and resolve. Finally, she pushed the door open, rain splattering her sweater, each step toward the house echoing like a drumbeat of war. Mark opened the door, surprise flashing in his eyes before hardening into wariness. Ellie shoved the letter into his chest, her voice shaking but fierce. "You knew. You let me drown in lies." Mark's jaw clenched, his shoulders rigid, raindrops sliding down her face as tears blended with storm water. He said, "I thought I was protecting you." Ellie's fists shook, rage boiling. "You broke me more by hiding it." The room behind him glowed dimly, but it felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. Their voices rose and cracked, two siblings bound by blood and betrayal, neither willing to step back. Inside the house, the storm followed them. Ellie stood in the living room, shoulders heaving, words spilling like fire. "You both betrayed me. Him with his lies, you with your silence." Mark's voice cracked. "I lost him too, Ellie. I didn't want to lose you." The confession tore through the air, but Ellie's anger refused to bend. "You already did." The rain pounded harder against the windows, thunder rolling like her fury. She dropped into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Mark reached out but froze, his hand trembling in midair, too afraid to touch. The silence between them was louder than any storm. The night stretched into eternity, but Ellie finally lifted her face, eyes raw and burning. She whispered, "I can't forgive him yet, and I don't know if I can forgive you." Mark lowered his gaze, pain etched deep. Sarah entered quietly, her presence steady, carrying warmth into the fractured space. She placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder and said, "Forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you." Ellie's breath trembled, her heart clawing between fury and release. She met Sarah's gaze, the strength there pulling her back from the edge. In that fragile moment, Ellie realized she had a choice: remain shackled to betrayal or begin the excruciating path of letting go. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world outside washed clean. Inside, Ellie sat on the couch, her body heavy but her breathing steadier. The letter lay folded on the table, no longer clutched like a weapon, but resting as part of the wreckage she carried. She whispered, "I can't undo the lies, but I can choose not to drown in them." Mark sat quietly in the corner, his face marked with guilt, but softened by exhaustion. Sarah brought tea, setting it before Ellie with a gentle hand. Ellie's fingers wrapped around the warm cup, trembling but firmer than the night before. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to close her eyes without collapsing under the weight of grief. She whispered, "I'm still here," and though her voice was fragile, the truth of it filled the room like the first fragile ray of light after a long storm. Ellie walked through the park later that afternoon, her steps unsteady but deliberate. The air smelled of wet earth, and the sound of laughter from children playing mingled with the whisper of leaves in the breeze. She carried no letter, no envelope, only the weight of her own thoughts. She sat on a bench, the same one where Mrs. Whittaker had once spoken to her. Closing her eyes, she repeated softly, "Grief changes shape." The words felt less like a sentence, and more like a guide. The ache in her chest remained, but beneath it pulsed something gentler, a fragile beginning. She inhaled deeply, the air cool and alive, as though the world was reminding her she was part of it still. That evening, Ellie lit a single candle at her dining table, its flame flickering against the shadows. The photograph of her husband rested nearby, propped against a stack of unopened bills she was no longer afraid to face. She touched the photo gently, her voice steady but soft. "I loved you. I still do. But I can't carry your secrets anymore." The words did not erase her pain, but they released something heavy inside her chest. Her tears came, not as violent sobs but as quiet streams. She whispered, "Goodbye," not as an ending, but as a step forward. The candle's glow reflected in her eyes, fragile yet unbroken. Later, Sarah returned, carrying 2 mugs of coffee as always. She placed one in front of Ellie without words, then sat across from her. The silence wasn't heavy now. It felt steady, like a bridge between them. Ellie looked at her friend and managed a faint, tired smile. "Thank you," she said, the words small but full of weight. Sarah replied softly, "You don't need to thank me. Just let me stay." Ellie nodded, her shoulders loosening, the first sign of trust returning. For the first time, she wasn't clinging to the past. She was sharing the present, fragile but real. The ache remained, but it no longer owned her. As the night grew quiet, Ellie walked to the bedroom, her body tired, but her steps steadier. She paused at the doorway, glancing back at Sarah asleep on the couch, then turned to the bed. She slid beneath the covers, staring at the ceiling where shadows shifted softly. She whispered into the silence, "I would do it all again, for love." The words lingered, wrapping around her like a fragile embrace. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, but this time they carried not just pain but acceptance. The camera of her mind lingered on her weary but tender face, filled with sorrow and love intertwined. The world would not stop hurting, but she was learning to live inside it again.